So let's start off with a question. We might make this question optional for the over 50s, but who's been to the doctor or the hospital this year? Yeah, got a few people that I have. Anyone want to tell me why? If it's private, you don't have to. Yeah, anyone? You went to the dentist, yeah? You went to the dentist, that's very good. Have you been twice this year or just once? Twice, amazing. Anyone else? Fee? The dentist as well, lots of dentists? Yes? You went to the hospital? Did it have a good outcome? No? Oh, I'm sorry about that. But the thing is, it wasn't always like that, was it? We sometimes take it for granted. The fact that we have doctors, the fact that we have hospitals, the fact that we even have this concept of medicine. You know, there used to be a time when there wasn't such thing as a hospital. There used to be a time when hospitals were first around, and actually you were worse off if you went to hospital, as opposed to if you stayed at home, because the hospital might not be very clean. Other people, might be near you, and you might catch their diseases, which are worse than your disease. So it's not always been around. But the amazing thing is that, in fact, although the Bible doesn't use this term medicine, there's so many ideas in the Bible that are similar to what we have today. The things we have today, the concepts that we know, that we understand, and the concepts that we take for granted. And what we're going to focus on tonight is the law of Moses. Okay, so the book of Leviticus, particularly, that's what we had read for us. The law of Moses, those first 5 books in the Old Testament. Now, how old are these first 5 books? That's on the screen, right? They're pretty old, okay? Pretty old, yeah? Anyone here that old? Anyone here born? No? 1500 BC? No? We've got no hands up? Okay. Well, the thing is that the Bible and the law of Moses, talking about these things, is written 3,000 plus years before we started to understand these things in modern medicine. So, for instance, let's take this lovely-looking French guy on the screen, Louis Pasteur, okay? Do you know what he came up with? Can anyone read the screen? What did he come up with? Pasteurizing, he did, absolutely. Yeah, and it's all linked to this idea of germ theory, because previously they didn't actually understand where disease came from. They thought it sort of appeared. So often they associate it with flies. A fly appears, oh, we've got some germs that also appear. So because they didn't understand this idea of germs, these tiny microorganisms that might live on your hand, that do live on your hand, okay? They might live on that door handle, okay? Might live on your Bible. Not all of these cause disease, but they didn't understand that. And because they didn't understand it, they didn't even think that, we can prevent it, we can do something about it. But the law of Moses tells us that we can, and that the Israelites could. And this is why we find that the Bible is amazing. It's ahead of its time. And so this is the message, the real weight of the message of what we're looking at tonight, is the fact that God knew all of these things over 3,000 years before man ever discovered it on his own. God knew that. And what that means for us is that the Bible is an incredible book because it was authored by someone who knows us better than we know ourselves, who knows the diseases that we suffer, who knows how to keep us healthy. So, reading the law of Moses, has anyone read the law of Moses? Yeah? Yeah? We've got a few nods, okay? A few people have looked at the first 5 books of the Bible, that's nice. Have you come up with lots of questions? Yeah? When you read through the book, the law, even tonight, that reading was a bit funny, right? A little bit funny, yeah? Do you come up with questions like this? This was some of my questions. Why are some animals unclean and why are some animals clean, right? Yeah? Anyone know any of the animals that were unclean? Anyone? Pigs. First one everyone goes to, lovely. Kangaroo, unclean, yeah. Bats, unclean, yeah. Are they all familiar? Yeah, the Israelites weren't allowed to eat bats, no? Or kangaroos. So good job there weren't any in Israel. What else do we have? All this talk of uncleanness. Yeah, why did some people have to wash themselves and some people had to be unclean for a period of time? Yeah, you read through that reading and you're like, what's all this being unclean stuff? Well, we're going to answer some of these questions tonight. Why did the law specify washing in running water? Just it says a few times, bathe in water, bathe in water. Come to verse 13, wash his flesh in running water. Oh, there's a little extra detail. Another thing, why did lepers have special requirements? So people with leprosy had to do something completely different to the rest of the camp of Israel. Or why did God not say, treat them the same as everyone else? Why did they have to have special requirements? Why were there special rules about what you touched with people who were sick and when you were sick? So it's a law of lots of questions, right? You read through it, you don't understand everything. But hopefully tonight we'll cover some of the reasons why. And maybe we'll have a few fewer questions afterwards. So what are we going to look at tonight? Well, 3 main areas, okay? So firstly, we're going to have a look at food hygiene. This is where we're going to consider some of the animals, some of the ones that were clean, some of them were unclean. We're going to look at preventing disease transmission, okay? Transmission just means spreading from person to person. And we're going to look at washing. Now, washing is very much tied in with preventing disease transmission, but it comes up so much, it's got its own special category. And what we're going to look at is we're going to look at each of these areas and how the law of Moses was incredibly ahead of its time. That God knew all these amazing details that we only really understood in the last 200 years. But he was understanding it over 3,000 years ago. We're going to have a look at the chapters in Leviticus that address this, and we're going to find out that God is truly an amazing author of the scriptures, and this Bible is so ahead of its time. So, food hygiene, okay? So we're going to consider some of the animals that they could or couldn't eat. Now, what was the first animal that was mentioned that you couldn't eat under the law? Yeah? Can you remember? Pig. A pig. One that looks maybe a bit like this, okay? So does anyone want to read out Leviticus 11, verse 7? Anyone want to read from the screen or read from your Bible? I'm looking at the... Yep, go on then, bud. Thank you. Now, does anyone understand, can anyone explain to me what chewing the cud is about? Yeah? Eating grass, yeah. Predominantly, it's about eating grass. They're herbivorous, which means they eat plants, right? Okay, and chewing the cud means that they eat grass and then they swallow it and then they bring it back up again a little bit nasty. They bring it back up again, have another chew, yeah, swallow it again. Means that they've got different chambers in their stomach which deals with it. Basically, they eat plants, right? But what the pig does is the pig doesn't chew the cud. The pig doesn't eat grass. And the pig is definitely a great example because that's what Jews don't eat today, right? If you have a kosher diet, you don't eat pigs. There's lots of people in the Middle East, the Arabs and other people that don't eat pigs. So if you go to places like Egypt and you look at the McDonald's menu, there's no bacon on the menu because they don't eat pigs, right? And you come to these conclusions and you're like, well, why is it there? Not there, it's normally there. It's because they don't eat pigs. So why pigs? Well, it's interesting because all the other nations round about ate pigs. Yeah, just the Israelites that didn't eat pigs. Well, here's something you can have a look at. Eating contaminated pork. Now, it's not meant to put you off your supper, but the idea is that pigs actually can contain some parasites, and they can contain some parasites which are different to some of these other animals that chew the cud. And the reason for that is because some of these parasites live in meat. Okay? They live in muscle. So if a cow eats grass, it's not going to eat any meat. And it's not going to eat anywhere that the parasites are living in. But a pig, well, it eats all sorts of scraps, doesn't it? Yeah? If pig swill is sort of anything that's left over from the kitchen, food scraps, meat scraps, plant scraps, everything. And because of that, they eat these contaminated meat. They can eat all these contaminated things, and the little parasites, little roundworms particularly, can go into the body and they can multiply, they can grow, they can develop in the muscle. And it's the muscle which we cook and eat and call meat, right? And this is what God knew about a pig. And so this here is some information that we know nowadays about trichinosis, which is one of the main parasitic infections, parasitic diseases that you can get from eating contaminated pork. There's also other ones down the bottom there that you can see, which are tapeworm related. So all these nasty parasites that you can get from pork. And there on the right-hand side, for instance, is a number of cases of this specific disease, trichinosis, and how you can see it's decreasing over time, right? So as they understand more and more, as they implement things like good food hygiene practices, okay? So you wash your hands before you prepare food, you keep food in the fridge, or you heat it up to certain temperatures, all of these things. But you'll also notice that the majority come from this brown bar on the left-hand side. Yeah, the majority of these cases coming from pork. So God knew that there was something about pork, something about the fact that they basically eat all sorts of rubbish, which means that they're actually going to be more likely to carry disease. And God knew that. That's why God put it into the law of Moses not to eat pork. Whereas today, what we can do is we can safely rear pork, we can rear pigs, we can test them, you can do all these sort of things. But God knew that it was much harder to do back then. They didn't have all these tests, they didn't understand all this. But this is what we're trying to say, that God knew in his foreknowledge that it was much better for the children of Israel not to eat pork. Now, can anyone remember about seafood? Yeah? So you could eat certain seafood, but you couldn't eat other seafood. Anyone know what you could and couldn't eat from the seas? Yep.
It had scales.
Scales and fins. Thank you very much. So this is the reference, Leviticus 11, verse 12. Okay? Whatsoever hath no fins or scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination unto you. Anyone give me any examples of things that don't have fins and scales? Yep. Crayfish. Yep. Crab. Yep. Eels. Crocodiles. I love all that. Yeah, octopus, all these things. Yeah, yeah. There's even some on the screen as well, right? Yeah, we've got there. Lobsters, prawns, mussels, oysters, yeah, all these things start making you hungry, make me hungry. No fins or scales. So what is it about these animals that God said not to eat? Well, you might hear people talk about prawns and other things as the filters of the sea, okay? Because they essentially, what they do is they take some of the bad stuff, some of the rubbish out of the sea and filter it through their shell and spit it out the other side, and they retain this. And this is why they can actually retain certain toxins. Now, again, this is not to put you off eating seafood. Everything is prepared to certain standards these days, so it is safe. But back in ancient Israel, they didn't know about all of this. And if you look at those 4 diseases, some of them are not looking particularly nice when it says sometimes fatal, and that's also not particularly nice, right? And so this is why you might wonder, well, why can the children of Israel eat some things? Like, why could they eat cows and other things that sometimes can cause food poisoning and not other things? And the suggestion would be that some of these diseases are actually a lot more severe. So, yes, some of you, I won't ask for a show of hands, some of you might have experienced food poisoning, from undercooked meat, maybe from beef, maybe from chicken and some of the other things. But it's a day or 2, quite unpleasant, but it can pass through the system. Whereas some of these other diseases, like you can get from seafood, actually have a much more lingering, a much more potent effect and can have worse outcomes. So the suggestion would be that God was saying, while all meat can be undercooked, can be contaminated, could potentially cause food poisoning, these are the ones to stay away from because they're more likely to lead to worse outcomes. Okay? And what's really interesting is that the fact that we sometimes see these sort of things, these sort of diseases coming up in other countries. This is just a little bit of travel advice around barley belly, actually, which is food poisoning that people get from barley because they haven't stored the food correctly, they haven't refrigerated the food correctly, they haven't heated the food up to certain temperatures. And you'll notice there on the right-hand side, to reduce your risks of eating contaminated food, they say don't eat undercooked meat or seafood. Okay? So again, the similar things that God understood and God wrote down in the law of Moses are coming up again. So to be aware of these meats, to be aware of food that's not properly prepared, again coming up. And these are things that we only started to understand, started to realize, rather than it being, it's a bit of bad luck if you felt ill because the germs just popped up out of nowhere. Well, now we understand where they came from. Now we understand how to prevent it, and we understand how to be hygienic when it comes to food. So, anyone know how we can handle food safely today? Yeah? Anyone give me any examples? I might have mentioned some already. Safe handling? Anyone done any courses? Have you got a temperature of food? Yeah, that's an amazing one. Yeah. Anyone know where the danger zone is for temperatures? Well, we'll put it up on the screen, shall we? Danger zone for temperatures between 5 and 60 degrees. And where were they living at the time that the law of Moses came? Well, they were in the desert, right? Some nice warm ambient temperatures. It's not like they were up in the Arctic and they could just stick the food under a pile of snow and keep it cool. No, they were in the desert, okay? So it's going to be some places where it's very hard to keep food to a specific temperature. And this is the thing as well about today and what we can do with food, is that if there is some pork that might be contaminated, if we heat it up to a very hot temperature, we can actually kill some of these parasites, we can kill some of these diseases, and we can get rid of it and reduce the risk. But they couldn't keep things out of that temperature, that danger zone so easily in the wilderness. So this is just to show that we understand some of these things today. There are certain practices that go on today that in the law of Moses and the time that they were in the wilderness, they couldn't do. And so what God set were restrictions around the foods and around the meats that were particularly risky. Okay? So God said pork, particularly risky. Okay? Any seafood that's not fish, also risky. And because they couldn't heat it up or they couldn't refrigerate it, God said, stay away from them and you'll be much healthier. What else do we do today? Well, we have precision temperature ovens. This one's quite interesting. There on the right-hand side, not necessarily as appropriate in Australia, but certainly in the UK, as soon as the summer comes out, they start talking about barbecue food safety, because so many people over there are unused to cooking food safely and handling food safely outside, because they think, oh, it's a lovely summer's day, it's our one in the year, and they suddenly pop out the barbecue and forget about things like heating up food properly, cooking food properly. And this is not what, they didn't have this in the wilderness. It's not like they could stick it in the oven, know that if the chicken was in there, or the quail, right? Quail was in there for a certain length of time, then it would come out and it would be perfectly cooked. No, you're cooking outside on a roasted fire. So again, this is increasing the risk of having some of these diseases. And so what God says is the foods that are even riskier, I'm going to say don't eat, and you can stay with the foods that are less risky, because they're cooking outside, they're cooking in the wilderness. It was a lot harder. And this is where we come to, well, when did they start understanding about these things? And we're going to mention Louis Pasteur a few times, but there's this great quote from these authors that said Louis Pasteur's contribution to the advancement of microbiology, so the study of living things that are very tiny, and to the development of modern food processes cannot be underestimated. And there it talks about pasteurization, the idea that you heat up food for a certain length of time, depending on what the thing is. You might heat it to different temperatures for different lengths of time, and the idea is that you can kill the germs that are in the food, and then you can bring it back down to temperature, and any germs that were previously in the food will be dead. But all these elements about microbiology, God actually knew. And this is what we're saying, that the term microbiology didn't even exist at the point that God wrote these things in the law of Moses. Incredible. All these things that God foreknew. So the next section, preventing disease transmission. Now, this is a great topic to have after 2 years of a pandemic, because it means that people know a little bit more about disease transmission. So what have you done, or what has society done in the last couple of years to prevent the transmission of COVID? Anything you can shout out? Masks, yeah, been wearing masks, that's one thing. Anything else? Washing hands, what did you say? Social distancing, yep, staying away from people. Anything else? Yep. Vaccinations, yep. Not necessarily one they had under the law of Moses, but yes. Lockdown, yep. So there's sort of more than just, lockdowns and isolations, all these different things to prevent disease transmission. So when we're talking about diseases that can be transmitted, that can be passed on from one person to another, we're talking about infectious diseases. The World Health Organization defines this as particular pathogenic, which means disease-causing microorganisms, such as bacteria, viruses, parasites, or fungi that can be spread directly or indirectly from one person to another. So the diseases can be spread, but how can they be spread? Okay. Well, last time you were sick, can you remember the last time you were sick? Hopefully it was a while ago. People might have had COVID recently. Do you know where you got it from? Yeah? No? No idea? Anyone caught COVID recently? Did you catch it from your mum, your dad, right? Your children, right? Probably more likely to go that way, to be honest, than the other way, yeah? And sometimes you can almost see COVID being passed on from one child to another as they walk up to them and sneeze in their face, right? Not so pleasant, but you can understand how diseases get passed through childcare so easily. So these are ways that diseases can be spread. This is from the SA Health website, okay? The ways that infectious diseases can be spread. So one way is droplet and aerosol spread. So when we say droplet or aerosol, we're talking about things like coughs, things like sneezes, okay? You sneeze. Have you ever seen the videos of people who put like food dye up their noses and then sneeze, and they go over like a canvas and you can see how far and how wide these droplets spread? If not, go home, ask your parents to watch it on YouTube later, okay? Fascinating about how far these droplets can spread and how far they can go. So if you sneeze on the second row, probably all this row and all the people next to you might potentially pick up, okay? Pick up this disease. If you sneeze, maybe just into the elbow, right? Okay? And coughs as well. The second one is fecal-oral spread. And when I say fecal, does everyone know what I mean? Means poo, okay? Hopefully we didn't get that on the recording. But basically what happens is if you have poor sanitation, you go to the toilet and you forget to wash your hands, or maybe choose not to wash your hands. And then you go and decide that I'm really looking forward to supper, and you eat something. But you're eating with these hands that have not been clean, have not been washed. And sometimes there can be bad things that come out of you. Okay, the body's actually getting rid of it because they don't want it in the body anymore. And what you're doing is saying, oh, I'm just going to put it straight back into my body. And that can also be a way of spreading disease. Another way is contact spread. Okay, so somebody's sick, you go and give them a hug, right? And they've got all these diseases on them, or you go and give them a handshake, right? Yeah, that's another thing we didn't do with COVID, right? Didn't handshake. Now they've got some germs on their hand, give them a handshake, right? They might have passed on those germs to you into your hand. Direct contact spread. And there's bodily fluid spread. So if you spit on someone or you wee on someone, hopefully that doesn't happen too often, but that's another way that diseases can be spread. And then there's these other considerations as well, this direct and indirect contact. So do you remember what people said about like door handles and some of these other areas during COVID? Anyone tell me what they said? No? Don't touch them? Yeah, don't touch your door handles. Use your elbow. They also said that these are the areas to particularly focus on when cleaning, right? So if you were to do a deep clean of Cumberland Hall every week, between meetings, all these sort of things, those would be the areas that you'd target. So the areas that people are most likely to touch frequently, and that would be through indirect contact. So somebody who's infected touches the door handle, you come along 10 minutes later, touch the same door handle. The germs that they might have put on that door handle, you then pick up. Okay? So there's all these different things. So now we've got a little task. We're about halfway through, and we're going to have a little task. Look at our reading. Okay? Leviticus 15, verses 1 to 13. Okay? And I'd like you to have a look through and see if you can match some of these ways of disease transmission to what you can read in the first 13 verses. Okay? Maybe I'll give you time to have a little look, and then we can have some feedback. So what can you see? Right? Well, while I let you look, I'll give you some context. Verse 2, it says that the whole chapter, or those verses anyway, are about someone with a running issue. What does that mean? Well, it means something that's gushing, something that's flowing. Yeah, you're getting the general idea. It could be actually any number of diseases. They didn't have a name for so many of the diseases back then. It could be anything that causes a discharge. It could be blood. It could be pus. It could be excessive sweating. All these sort of things there. They're all issues, okay? They're all running issues, and often these running issues are basically an outward sign of a physical sign of an inward disturbance within the body. So when someone gets a runny nose, you might think, I've got a cold because I've got a runny nose. That would also be a running issue, okay? So what have people found in the first 15 verses? Any ways of disease spread? Yep. Verse 8 and 11, what's verse 8 talk about? If you spit on someone, absolutely, yeah. Okay, that spit could be through a sneeze, yeah, in droplet form, or it could be a bodily fluid, yeah. Anyone else? toucheth, good. We've got the direct contact spread. Anything else? The sitting, yep, sitting on what? Sitting on a seat. And what's happened to that seat? Someone else has sat on it first. Yeah, so we've got this indirect contact. Anything else people can find? Yeah, the saddle is in there as well. So it's not just the seat, it could be the saddle. Yep. Utensils. Yep. Yep. Anything else? The sheets on the bed. Absolutely, we've got that in verse 4, don't we? Clothes. Yep. And with the touching one, did you notice that it's both ways? Okay. So, for instance, we got verse 7. He that toucheth the flesh of him that hath the issue. Okay. And then verse 11 is, and whomsoever he toucheth that hath the issue. Okay. So if you go to someone who's sick and touch them, that can spread it. If they are sick and they come to you and touch you, that can spread it. Okay. The law of Moses is very prescriptive. So shall we go through them? Shall we have a look? There's one more. Different materials. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Oh, we might have a slide later on about that. Okay, so we've got verse 2. We've got verse 2, the idea of a running issue. Okay, that's going to be a bodily fluid way of spreading it. Verse 4, we've got the contaminated bedding, so indirect contact. So you go and change the sheets of someone that has contaminated bedding, you could potentially catch it. Contaminated seating in verse 6. We've got direct contact. Verse 7, I've put verse 8, the spitting is droplet spread, but we could also have it as bodily fluid spread. Saddles, verse 11, direct contact. And verse 12, we've got the vessels of earth and the vessels of wood. So I think we got 100%. So well done, Cumberland. And you can, in your own time, maybe under adult supervision, read the rest of the chapter about bodily fluids and all the ways that you prevent the spread of those. So if we go through each of these ways of spreading disease, let's have a look at what we do now and what they did under the law of Moses. So this one about spitting, this droplet and aerosol spread, that was the first one we had on the list of ways that diseases can be spread. And again, we're going to take you back to 1859 when Louis Pasteur understood that you could actually spread disease by germs. And this is why we have all these posters up. Okay, there's a couple down the left-hand side. You've seen them a few more times during COVID, right? Up everywhere. If you cough, cover your cough. If you sneeze into your elbow. Clean your hands. All of these sort of things. And the reason for that is to reduce and minimize this aerosol spread. God knew. This is what we keep coming back to. God knew how disease spread, right? God knew that if you were going to spray someone with your spit, okay, you're going to spit on someone, that could potentially pass on the disease. It's not the disease suddenly appears from a fly or just some dust, as they used to believe. They're called spontaneous generation of germs. No, God knew that it could pass from somebody who was ill to somebody else. And this is what we understand today, many, many years later, thousands of years later. Contact spread. Now, this is an interesting one. It actually comes up multiple times. It's not just in Leviticus 15 with the discharges. We also find it in Leviticus 13 regarding leprosy, in Numbers chapter 19 with dead bodies. Multiple times we have the fact that you shouldn't touch these things because touching could cause disease. So Numbers 19 verse 16. Shall we get someone to read? Yeah, get fed up of talking. Anyone want to read what's on the screen? Go on. Thanks very much, Bud. So here we've got an example of all these different things you can touch if you're touching dead bodies, right? So somebody dies, potentially you could have all sorts of diseases that start growing in this dead body. You know, it's nice and warm and wet, perfect place for diseases to start growing. And God says, if you're going to touch it, you're going to be unclean 7 days. Now today, what do we do when they're handling dead bodies? Or what do they do when they're handling things that might cause them disease? Well, they wear personal protective equipment, right? So during COVID, have you seen some of the pictures of the hospital workers? Yeah, you've seen some pictures? What have they been wearing? Yeah? They've been wearing gloves, right, yeah? First thing I do? Yeah? Yep. Plastic onesies. Pretty much. It's one way of describing them. Absolutely. Yes? They wear masks. Yeah, sometimes they wear something even bigger. Full shield, full face shield, yeah? They wear hats. Sometimes they wear goggles as well. In fact, some workers were having so much on them that they decided to print out a photo of what their face really looked like and put it here so that people understood who they were, right? Or had name tags and other things. This is how much personal protective equipment they were wearing. You might have also seen, like with the Ebola virus a few years ago, you saw these pictures of yellow hazmat suits, okay, where people are sort of walking around going in these suits, right? Because they're trying to protect themselves. And this is trying to protect this contact spread. So what happens is once you've finished work, you take it all off and it goes and is disposed of. All these different things. Now this one, the fecal-oral spread, is quite interesting. We've put a different version on the screen, the ESV. Okay? Anyone want to read out what we've got on the screen? Someone other than Josiah? Anyone want to read out the screen? Do we have to pick on one of the old ones? The really old ones? Anyone?
You shall have a place outside the camp, and you shall go out to it. And you shall have a trowel with your tools. When you sit down outside, you shall dig a hole in, and turn back and cover up your excrement.
Thank you very much. So it's a little bit clearer in the ESV. The King James Version talks about a paddle, and that just makes it sound like it's a canoe ride or something like that. In fact, it's more of a trowel, so something to dig up the ground. And this is completely different. Like, have you heard about the Middle Ages, right? Have you heard about all these times where people just did something and then they threw it out the window into the street, okay? Or they had a very small courtyard, which about 50 people used, and everybody used the toilet in the courtyard or threw out their muck into the courtyard, or the fact that in the medieval times, some of them actually had to wear platform shoes, which would carry them above the muck on the streets, okay? This is what happened. But in ancient Israel, no, God said, you're going to do something very particular when you go to the toilet, when you do a number 2, right? Okay, there was going to be a place outside the camp. So you had to be away from where you were living, where you were eating, where you were sleeping. We want to make sure it's far away, okay? You've got to go outside the camp. And it says you're going to have a trowel with your tools, and when you sit down, you're going to dig a hole, right? You're going to dig a hole. Everybody had tools for this. It wasn't just the priests could do it within the camp and everybody else could do it outside the camp because they were special. No, everybody did this. This was across all stratas of society. Everyone dug their own hole. You did your bodily waste into the hole, and you covered the sewage. Okay, it means that other people, other animals, other people are not going to be able to touch it. Right? It's going to be away. It's going to be disposed of because of the fact that diseases can be picked up with touching fecal matter. But they didn't understand this for centuries. This is why people lived in absolute squalor. This is why they had it in the streets, running around. They wondered why there was things like cholera epidemics. And that was because the water well had contaminated sewage seeping into it. And this is another great example, 1855, with the famous nurse Florence Nightingale, who said something's happening in the hospital and something's going badly. As in they had people come into the hospital and the death rates just kept going up and up and up. And they looked into it and they found that the hospital itself in the Crimean War was built on a sewer. Great place for the hospital to be built. And so Florence, she instigated in all these different changes, which included ventilation, which included being flushing out some of the hospital, washing it out, moving the patients further apart, and the death toll began to fall. Just from the fact that the place was much cleaner. And what do we do today in hospitals? Well, you might see soiled linen bags. We had that example here of like beds and other things, bed sheets. Well, in the hospital, if you've got a sick person, you can take it all, you can put it in a soiled linen bag, and they throw that in the wash, or maybe throw it away, depending on how bad it is, okay? And it's all going to be disposed of safely. No one's going to touch it. And we also have flushing toilets and other things like that, which make it a lot easier to keep the sewage far away from us and not have this spread. So really, the one thing you should do is wash your hands after going to the toilet, and you should be pretty safe. Right, we're up to our last section, okay? We're going to have a look at washing. Now, you said some of you have read the Law of Moses before, right? So can anyone give any examples of where washing happens in the law?
The priest did it when they were serving and cleaning the animals and
Yep.
all that.
Yep. A lot in the worship of God, absolutely. Which had some spiritual significance, of being clean and bringing your best before God and clean heart and mind as well as a clean body. Yep. Anywhere else?
Reading the unclean before.
They were. We had it a lot of times in our reading. Okay, these are just some examples. So we've got the priests washing regularly. They even, because they had to wash regularly, they even had a special bit of furniture in the tabernacle called the laver, which was for washing. Right? So we also had sacrifices that also had to be washed, and after touching dead animals, okay, you also had to wash yourself. Okay, so this is, for instance, if you prepare meat. Now, everyone saw the fact that washing came up multiple times in our reading, right? Anyone find a verse with washing in it? Just shout them out, yep. 13, yep, we do. Anyone else? 5, 6, 7, yep. 8, 10, 11, good. Throughout, right? Okay, throughout the reading, we've got all these wash, right? We've got to bathe himself in water. We've got wash his clothes. We've got wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, bathe his flesh in running water, all these things, all the times. And it wasn't just the person who was sick, but it was anyone that they came into contact with, right? Anyone who touched the bedding. Everybody had to wash themselves. Now, was this a big deal? Well, yes, they couldn't just turn on the taps, right? And have a shower. It's easy these days, have a 2-minute shower. Doesn't mean you have a 2-minute shower, but you can do it, right? Okay? Same with washing clothes. You just shove the clothes in, click on, come back in an hour, and they're clean. No, it was actually a lot of effort for them to do this. But God said, no, you've got to do it. In fact, some people lived in clothes for days on end in times past. Some people were sewn into their clothes over winter because they didn't see the need to clean clothes. So why did God say all these things? Well, it was to prevent disease transmission, right? It was to make sure that this person was clean, that they could wash away all the germs, and anyone that touched the sick person could also wash. Now, the running water is interesting in verse 13, this extra little detail. You might wonder, well, why running water? Well, not that we expect tons of streams in the desert, but you can imagine that if you wash in a pond or something that's a bit still, you've not got the same freshness to that. You might have a bit of a stagnant pond like we've got there, whereas if it's running water, it's a river. You can wash yourself and all those germs can be washed away, right? The same if you are, I think we've got on the right, we've got a bucket there, okay? The same if you've got a bucket, instead of having a bath, and often in the olden days, if you had a bath and the next person had a bath and the next person had a bath and the next person had a bath, and you'd be sharing your germs with all these people. No, God said in running water, okay? So pour out that water and you wash under that running water. You're not going to be reusing it all the time. Just a little detail that showed that God knew how best to get rid of disease. And verse 11 of Leviticus 15, we had a specific part of the body that was to be washed, and that was the hands. Okay? It specifically says you should wash your hands if the one with the discharge touches you, or if you touch the one with the discharge. And hand washing is interesting because there was this guy called Ignaz Semmelweis, and he actually found out that hand washing was a good thing. And the way that he did that is he went into where some women were giving birth. And they had some doctors in the other room that were dissecting bodies and other things. They might have been doing post-mortems, trying to find out why they'd died. And they were coming straight from doing that to delivering children. And people kept dying. And then what he said is, no, you should wash your hands. You should, and he put some chlorinated lime water there to wash your hands in before coming from one room to the other. And he found that the death rate of women giving birth declined. Unfortunately, the way he told the doctors about it was he started calling them murderers, and they didn't like that, which meant it took a lot longer for people to realize the importance of washing hands. But look at the dates on that. 1800s, right? This was in the law of Moses, that if you're in contact with a sick person or if you're in contact with a dead person, wash your hands. And it took thousands of years before modern medicine decided that. And you can see things like this all over the place. On the left-hand side is one for clinicians from the World Health Organization. There on the right-hand side is one from Government of Queensland Health, talking about how clean hands save lives, something we know of today. So, another question, got a few minutes left. Another question is, can you see another word that keeps coming up in those first 13 verses of Leviticus 15? We said washing keeps coming up, there's another word. Yep. Issue does keep coming up. We've covered that a little bit, the bodily fluids. Is there another word we haven't covered as much? Unclean. Okay? Unclean, 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 right? I could ask you to say a verse that has the word unclean in it, and I think you're pretty much going with every single verse. Okay? And there you can see on the screen all the ideas of being unclean coming out. Now, what does it mean to be unclean? Well, Leviticus 13 actually makes it a lot clearer. Leviticus 13 is talking about leprosy, okay? People that have, unfortunately, a bacterial infection in their skin, and it says this is what they should do. They should rend their clothes, they should have their head bare, they should put a covering upon their upper lip, which is interesting, it's like a parallel to the face mask today, and they should cry unclean, unclean, so that people know that they're unclean. All the days wherein the plague shall be in him, he shall be defiled, he is unclean, he shall dwell alone, without the camp shall his habitation be. So what's it saying? It's saying that this person should be avoided, that there should be no physical contact with them. There's a potential for harmful contamination or infection. And sometimes they could get better, they could go through a purification process, which involved a lot of washing, and there's all those sort of things. But there was something else that could be unclean in verse 12. Did you see that? I think we had it mentioned down here that there's two different types of vessels that could be unclean. Okay? So it's not just people that can be unclean, but objects can be unclean. Some of the objects can be washed, whereas earthen vessels, it says, should be broken, as opposed to vessels of wood, which could be rinsed. Now, this is interesting. So if we say that unclean, it has to be separated, has to be washed, or potentially be broken. Well, why not wood? And this is something to do with special properties of wood. Here's just a little sample from a review they did of lots of studies looking at wood, and they found out that wood can actually kill bacteria. Okay? So many different species. Look at this one in the middle. Okay? 30 different species of trees they tested, and all of them, it says that they observed antimicrobial properties, which means it kills microbes, it kills small organisms, right? All these things that wood can do that ceramic, pottery, other things couldn't, okay? Which is why you smash your pottery, but you can wash your wood. What would the modern equivalent of being unclean be? Well, it would be this idea that we're very familiar with because we've had COVID. Well, some of us have had COVID. We've had COVID come through the country of quarantining, of isolating. So there's lots of similarities, I suppose, with the pandemic, with preventing disease spread in the pandemic and under the law of Moses. The idea of being unclean is so similar to the idea of isolating and quarantine, which we've had today. This is another example of how the law of Moses was very up to date for its time, amazingly scientifically accurate. And the reason we don't do more quarantine today is because you can take things like medications, right? Or they understand that specific diseases can be transmitted, others couldn't. Back in the law of Moses, they didn't know that. They couldn't say, oh, yes, you've got a cold, you might spread it, you've got something else, you might not spread it. No, so what God said is, you're going to be unclean. Okay? If you've got these running issues, if you've got signs of disease, you're going to be unclean, you're going to be separate from other people, you're going to isolate and quarantine. So there's lots of things you can do. And there's many other things in the law of Moses that you could look at. And you could look at more foods to eat and the foods to avoid. Why specific things? Bats is an interesting one. You know, there's theories about various strains of influenza coming from bats, or eating blood and fat. You know, you might think, oh, why didn't they do that? Well, from a health point of view, you obviously don't want to eat lots of fat. Creatures with unknown causes of death, how you were to treat them, purification of women after childbirth, incestuous relations, how long to keep meat, dealing with dead bodies. And then there's interesting, if you look at Leviticus 13 and compare your modern day visit to the GP with what they did with the priest in Leviticus 13, it's very similar. You know, you come, you talk, say, look, I've got this. Then they bring out the stethoscope, or in the olden days, they would just have a look, right? And they would inspect what was going on in the same way as doctors do today, and then they'll book a follow-up visit, right? 7 days later. It's a very similar process. Amazing. And so these are all various other ways in which the law of Moses was ahead of its time. So I've covered these three areas because it's 5:2. We won't tell you if you've learned anything, ask if you've learned anything from each section, but hopefully you can remember something. But what the Bible does promise, and this is amazing, is that because God knows why diseases happen, how diseases are spread, how to prevent diseases, God knows how to prevent diseases completely and utterly. And this is what God promises in Revelation 21. It says, God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain. All those diseases that can lead to death, can lead to pain, gone. For the former things are passed away. So that's the better day to come that the Bible promises, where we don't have to worry about these things like disease. So what have we seen? Well, we've seen the fact that the Bible is incredibly scientifically advanced for its time when it was written, thousands of years before we even came to understand things like germs, hand washing, staying away from the sick, all these things. And because it's so advanced for its time, wouldn't you consider the Bible a book worth reading? Thank you.